for this third video, we're going to continue the idea where we left off, and we're going to really examine what Aristotle has to say positively about how we'll recognize what the best life is. And we'll finish by quickly looking at where we left off, because the video got cut short there briefly. But we had this idea that people ultimately disagree about what happiness is. And we're left with puzzles, we're left with aporia, we're left with impasses in trying to understand happiness, because while we all seek to be happy, we all don't understand what happiness is. And so what we're going to look at next is what are some of the qualities, right? What are some of the qualities of identifying the kinds of actions, the kinds of life, the kind of activities over a course of a life that will ultimately lead to our human happiness, right? And so the first thing that it's going to be interesting, I think, for us to look at, but let's think about this. We're gonna look at what is human happiness. And one of the first thing to point out here is that for Aristotle, he's going to say that human happiness is distinctly human. That it's the happiness of a human being. That if we want to understand human happiness, we need to understand how our happiness is a sort of manifestation of what it means to be human, of our nature. He's going to say that us understanding our own happiness, our own good, is ultimately about understanding our nature. And of course, that's illegible handwriting. It's one of my greatest faults as a human being, is my poor handwriting. But we're going to see how happiness is a manifestation that's unique to us as human beings. And so Aristotle, in chapter 7 of the Nicomachean Ethics, he's going to start to draw some interesting distinctions about understanding our human nature. And Aristotle's going to first identify, you can read the text here in book 1, chapter 7, but he's first going to identify two qualities, or two characteristics of the kinds of activities that would show up as part of our human happiness. And Aristotle, the first of these, will say that the kinds of activities would have to be complete, right? And what does it mean by complete? He says that it is not subordinate to other ends, right? That it would be the kind of activity that it ultimately is not subordinate to some other end. We don't do it for the sake of anything else, but purely for itself. That's a complete end. And secondly, Aristotle is going to say that it has to be self-sufficient. And now, by self-sufficient, he doesn't mean that we need to be self-sufficient as people, that we don't have any relationship to anyone else, that we can live entirely on our own. No, he's going to say that self-sufficient means that the kinds of activity that we seek through the course of this life, it lacks for nothing. That activity is self-sufficient. There is nothing that is necessary to add to that activity in order to be part of happiness. And one of the things, this is an interesting criticism for our kinds of human actions, that there's a lot of things that we do that are incomplete, that are subordinate to other ends, and are not sufficient. Think about the ways that we seek happiness. Perhaps we seek happiness in our life, or maybe we spend our life doing a job that we hate. Oh, so many people do this. Or even going to school. For some of us, it's not really desirable for its own sake. It's just something that we kind of do for the sake of something else. And so we feel like we need to add something to our lives, that our lives lack something. And so what do? We go and drink heavily on the weekend, or watch lots of television, or these things, and that is supposed to add something to our life that seems to lack something. And then if you look at those acts individually, does watching TV lack for nothing? Does it contain everything that would ultimately be part of our happiness? I think it does. Drinking beer is nice, but it seems to lack. And so these two characteristics will help us analyze this, and Aristotle is going to push us further. If we want to really understand what makes an act completely non-subordinate, complete, and self-sufficient, we need to understand human acts in particular. And so let's take a quick look here at Book 1, Chapter 7. And in Book 1, Chapter 7, it's taking me a second to find this. Here we go. Aristotle is taking a look at what it means to be a human being, and what's described here as the function of a human being, right? And so let's read this together. It says, but presumably the remark that the best good is happiness is apparently something generally agreed, and we still need a clearer statement of what the best good is. He's already said that a couple times. Remember, this text is not a carefully written text. It's kind of edited together. Let's continue. Perhaps then we shall find this if we first grasp the function of a human being. For just as the good, i.e. doing well, of a flautist, a sculptor, or every craftsman, and in general for whatever has a function and a characteristic action seems to depend on its function, the same seems to be true for a human being if a human being has some function. And so Aristotle ultimately asks, is there something that makes humans unique, right? What is the function of man? In other words, what is, and I'll put it this way, the characteristic activity of a human. What is it? What kinds of things do humans do that makes them human? I mean, that's kind of how we show up as human, that we live a particular kind of life, that we do particular kinds of things that's different than any other kind of creature that we encounter. What kind of activity is characteristic of the human being? And Aristotle will go through several options, trying to think about what is ultimately the characteristic activities of a human being. And so I'm getting the page again. Let's start here at the bottom of in our text, page 8, marginal line 1098a. Aristotle wonders, what then could this be? For living is apparently shared with plants, but what we're looking for is a special function of a human being. And so it's not about just being alive that makes us human, because lots of things are alive. That's kind of obvious. But what are some of the activities that are shared with other things that are alive? Aristotle will say we set aside the life of nutrition and growth, right? And so when we think about being human, part of what we spend our life doing is we focus on what we eat and growing, and even procreation and things like this. And Aristotle is not going to say that our highest good and happiness is going to consist in those, because that's not unique to us. We'll come back to some of these ideas. Let's continue. He says, the life next in order is some sort of life of perception, but this too is apparently shared with the horse, ox, and every animal. It's not enough just to have sense perception, to perceive things. The remaining possibility then is some sort of life of action of the part of the soul that has reason. One part of it has reason as obeying reason. The other has it as itself having reason and thinking. Moreover, here we go, life is also spoken of in two ways, as capacity and activity. And here we go. We must take a human being's special function to be life as activity, since this seems to be called life more fully. We have found, then, that the human function is an activity in the soul in accordance with reason or requiring reason. Right? And so the next kind of idea here is that if we're going to understand the characteristic activity of a human being, what really changes the way in which we exist as human beings, that is going to be reason. In another text, Aristotle calls us, as human beings, he calls us rational animals. We are rational animals, that we share the other qualities that animals have. Just notice that we're alive, and so we deal with growth and all that stuff. But not only are we alive, and not only do we sense, but we have reason. And here's this interesting thing that I would argue that reason, our rationality, our reason transforms all of our activities. The first thing that reason does is it transforms all our lower activities, for the most part, right? And if you think about, for instance, the way that we eat as human beings. We do not eat the way animals eat. Quite literally, we don't eat the way they eat. We don't, gorge ourselves. Well, sometimes we do. But we don't eat the same kinds of things. And when we eat, we have a sort of higher way of eating. We eat fancier foods. We eat in the right context. We eat with certain people. We'll be willing to pay quite a lot of money to eat at a particular restaurant with a particular person. It's more, there's almost a kind of beauty that could be possible through our kinds of eating. Certainly something like sex is like that too. For an animal, having sex is, well, animalistic. It's for the sake of procreation and whatever, maybe even pleasure in some sense too. But for humans, it's not just about copulation. It's not just about having a certain biological reaction, but it matters to us who we would have sex with. and the reasons that we're having sex. It reveals something deeper about a relationship. So even these, what you might call these shared or even lower activities, are themselves transformed by us being rational animals. That it's our reason in some sense transforms these. But then Aristotle, not only are our lower activities transformed, but we also have higher activities that are unique to us as human beings. For instance, math. Because you might not think of math as being all that great, or poetry, or music, right? Or countless other things that really are unique to us as human beings, and perhaps are even higher kinds of activities that connect to happiness. And so Aristotle is going to say, what is happiness? Well, happiness is going to be an activity of our highest virtues. In other words, the highest kinds of things that we can possibly do. What do we mean by a virtue? Well, by a virtue we mean doing something well, the well-doing or the excellence of an activity. Let's just read a little bit here, again from chapter 7 in book 1. Aristotle says, "Now we say that the function of a kind of thing, of a harpist, for instance, is the same in kind as the function of an excellent individual of that kind, of an excellent harpist, for instance." Right? And when we see this, the same is true. But it's more about not just having a particular activity, but ultimately doing it well, the doing well of certain activities. So what we're going to see, I'm trying to wrap this up quickly here. Then we say happiness is an activity of our highest virtues. There's going to be multiple things that matter. First of all, it's going to matter what we do, and second, it's going to matter how we do it. That not only does it matter what we do, but it's going to matter the kinds of character that we have and the manner in which we try to perform actions. And that's what we're really going to analyze over the next several classes, is this idea of virtue, of what it means to do and act well. And then we're going to dig into the kinds of actions that seem to most fulfill these qualities, that are complete, self-sufficient, that fulfill a characteristic activity of us as human beings, our rationality.